Welcome to Easy Anatomy. I'm going to talk to you today about contents of cranial cavity. If you look at the cranial cavity, you will see that it is a brain box containing brain tissue. So you have brain inside and the brain which is made of cerebral hemisphere, right and left, cerebellum, brain stem, and brain stem is made of three parts: medulla, pons, and midbrain. Then the brain is surrounded by meningeal covering, and this meningeal covering is formed of three layers. The outermost layer is Dura Mater, the second layer is arachnoid, and the deepest layer, which lining the brain itself, is called pia mater. Then inside cranial cavity you will find the blood vessels, and the blood vessels we have all blood vessels inside the cranial cavity are mainly coming from internal carotid and vertebrobasilar system. Internal carotid coming from common carotid artery, vertebrobasilar system originally coming from subclavian. Then you have meningeal arteries, and the meningeal arteries, if you remember, the major meningeal arteries we had coming from maxillary are accessory meningeal and middle meningeal arteries. So here you have accessory and the middle meningeal, and both of them coming from maxillary artery. Then you have the 12 cranial nerves, 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Okay, finally, remember that the brain is surrounded or is protected by circulating fluid is called cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid. So those are the contents of the cranial cavity. I'm going to start talking to you about dura, and not dura in general. I'm going to talk to you about meninges or meningeal covering. So let us start with how many layers do we have? We have 3 layers. So meningeal covering of brain, you have dura, you have second layer is arachnoid, and then you have pia mater. Okay, the Dura Mater has 2 layers, outer and inner. The outer layer, it is the endocranium, or it is the periosteal layer, which covering bone of cranium from inside the inner surface of the cranial bone. Then you have the inner layer, which you call it Dura Mater proper. Both layers are firmly attached together. So those 2 layers are firmly attached together, except where they form venous sinuses. They separated at venous sinuses or dural venous sinuses, and second, when they form enfolding or dural folds, and the dural folds like falx cerebri, which separate the 2 cerebral hemisphere, tentorium cerebelli, which separates cerebrum from cerebellum and act like a tent covering cerebellum, falx cerebelli, which separates the 2 halves of cerebellum, and there are other smaller parts like diaphragmacella, which covering pituitary gland and sella turcica. So if you imagine, here is the brain, cerebral hemisphere, you have one on each side, okay, and as you see, this elevation is called gyrus, and the depression is called sulcus. Okay, then here is the bone, the skull bone, the cranium. We start with inner layer. Inner layer is called pia mater. This is the pia mater. As you see, It is lining brain tissue. Okay, and go into the floor of the sulci. Then the second layer is called arachnoid and covering brain, but does not go into the sulci. Okay, and there is a space between the pia and arachnoid matter. This space is called what? Subarachnoid space. So this is the subarachnoid space. Okay, so this is arachnoid, and the red one is pia. The space is subarachnoid space. Okay, coming to the outermost layer, which is Dura Mater. The Dura Mater has two layers. Here is the outer layer, which lining the bone from inside. This is representing the periosteum. Okay. Then you have the inner layer, which you called Dura Mater proper. You see, it's going to be attached to the outer layer like one layer, connected together like one layer. Okay. However, coming here, where they separate from each other, they form sinuses. So the inner layer extend in between the cerebral hemisphere, for example, like this. This is the inner layer. This is the outer layer, which representing the periosteum, skull bone. This is the Dura Mater proper. Dura proper. Then separating here, forming sinus. In this case, the upper sinus is called superior sagittal sinus. And this fold which extend between the cerebral hemispheres is called falx cerebri. So you have sinus here, you have another sinus here, which is called inferior sagittal sinus. Okay, so what about arachnoid matter? The arachnoid matter here is going to project and open into superior sagittal sinus, forming this villi. So what is this fluid again in the subarachnoid space? Cerebrospinal fluid. So here is the cerebrospinal fluid. So cerebrospinal fluid is going to be filtered into superior sagittal sinus through this villi. What is the name of this villi or granulation? We call it arachnoid villi. Okay, arachnoid villi. So here is superior sagittal sinus, inferior sagittal sinus, and you have again this falx is called falx cerebri. So or what I need from you to remember that we have three layers: pia, arachnoid, and dura. And the dura has two layers: outer layer lining the bone, inner layer. Okay, they are connected together like one layer, except when they want to separate from each other to form this space is called the sinus, the dural sinus. And also the inner layer can extend between different parts of the brain, like this, in this case, falx cerebri, between the two cerebral hemispheres. Then you have the arachnoid matter, this layer. Between the arachnoid and the pia, you have subarachnoid space containing cerebrospinal fluid and also blood vessels of the brain. So blood vessels circulating also here. Okay. Then the cerebrospinal fluid is going to be filtered into superior sagittal sinus through these projections, which are called arachnoid villi. Okay. So now we are going into more detail about sinuses, dural sinuses. When it comes to dural sinuses, we need to remember that those are veins or venous spaces. So dural sinuses, those are venous space, drain brain and cerebrospinal fluid into systemic veins. Systemic veins. What is a systemic vein in this case? Is going to be internal jugular vein, which take blood and CSF back to the heart. Okay, so those sinuses are venous spaces. So they are made of dura, but to accommodate the circulating blood, keep in mind that blood cannot circulate within rough space or rough. They cannot come in touch with rough layer. That's why those sinuses are lined by endothelium, similar to blood vessels. Okay? So what are those dural sinuses? Remember, we have single and we have paired. The single sinuses are superior sagittal, inferior sagittal. You have only one straight sinus. Okay, you have occipital sinus and basilar plexus of veins, or also the confluence. We're going to talk about that. Those are the single: superior sagittal, inferior straight, occipital, and basilar plexus of vein and the confluence. The paired sinuses, one on each side, you will see sphenoparietal. You have cavernous behind it. Okay, you have superior petrosal, inferior petrosal sinus, then transverse and sigmoid. Those are paired sinuses. Let us look at the location inside the cranial cavity of all these sinuses. If I start from superior sagittal sinus, this is the groove for superior sagittal sinus. This is the inner surface of the skull cap, the vault of the skull. It extends from the frontal crest back until it reaches to the internal occipital protuberance. Okay, and it is located here. This is the superior sagittal sinus. And keep in mind, when you see this indentation and this fingerprints of arachnoid villi and granulation, they get in touch. When they come, those are projection from arachnoid mater into superior sagittal sinus to open here. Okay, they're gonna open here, so they have this kind of fingerprint. Okay, those are fingerprints or indentations of arachnoid villi and the granulation. So, where is the inferior sagittal sinus? In the lower border of falx cerebri. Then where is straight sinus? Straight sinus is going to be here at the junction between tentorium cerebelli and falx cerebri. Okay, over the tentorium cerebelli. This is the occipital sinus, location of occipital sinus. This is the location of basilar plexus of veins on the clavus. So those are the single sinus, superior and inferior in relation to falx cerebri in upper and lower border. Straight sinus at the junction between tentorium and falx cerebri. Then occipital sinus is located in relation to falx cerebelli, not cerebri, and it is related to the internal occipital crest. This is the occipital sinus. Basilar plexus of veins located on the clavus. This area, you see this depression here, this is where is the confluence of sinuses. It is the point of meeting of several sinuses. occipital, transverse, superior-sagittal. Okay, superior-sagittal coming from up, transverse sinus on each side, and occipital down here. So this area we call it again the veins or location, or the venous sinus located here is called the confluence of sinuses because it is the meeting of 1, 2, 3, 4 sinuses, two transverse, occipital, and superior sagittal sinus. Okay, how about bird sinuses? We start from the lesser wing of sphenoid, sphenoparietal. Then behind here on each side of sella turcica, you have cavernous sinus. Then behind here you have superior petrosal sinus at the upper border of the petrous bone. Inferior petrosal sinus located in relation or between the petrous bone and occipital bone in the petro-occipital fissure. This is petro-occipital fissure. Inferior petrosal sinus located here. And notice here that it go down to the jugular foramen because it is going to end up into internal jugular vein. The inferior petrosal sinus, it is the first tributary of internal jugular vein. Behind here, you have transverse sinus, one on each side. And transverse sinus is going to continue down here as sigmoid. Then sigmoid continue as internal jugular vein. Transverse, sigmoid, internal jugular vein. Okay, those are paired sinuses. Sphenoparietal, cavernous, superior petrosal, inferior petrosal, sigmoid, transverse. Okay. Now, I will dedicate the next few minutes for the cavernous sinus. Cavernous sinus. Cavernous sinus, it is located, as we mentioned, on each side of sella turcica. Here is the sella turcica, where the pituitary gland is located. Then anterior here, superior orbital fissure. Superior orbital fissure. Behind here, this is the petrous bone. This is superior orbital fissure, petrous bone. This is sphenoid bone. Okay. Then you have cavernous sinus is located on each side. This is the cavernous sinus. Okay, cavernous sinus. It is very important to know that cavernous sinus is unique because it is the only sinus which contain nerves and the artery traveling through it. Nerves and the artery traveling through it. The nerves traveling through the cavernous sinus, they want to go to the orbit. Here is the orbit, to supply muscles of the eye and also receive sensation from the eye. Those nerves are oculomotor, number 3, cranial nerve, trochlear, cranial nerve number 4, okay, abducent nerve is going in the floor of the cavernous sinus. Ophthalmic nerve, remember which ganglion is located here? Which ganglion located in this area? Trigeminal ganglion, correct? So here is a trigeminal ganglion. Give this nerve, which is V3, this foramen ovale. Foramen rotundum is located below the sinus. That's why you will see that maxillary nerve is going through the sinus. And you have this nerve, which is the ophthalmic nerve, is going also through the sinus, V1. So V1 and V2, and this is V2. and this is abducent nerve, which is cranial nerve number 6. Okay, so those are nerves inside. Through the lateral wall, you have number 3, cranial nerve number 3, oculomotor, cranial nerve number 4, which is called trochlear, cranial nerve number 6, and those nerves supplying extraocular muscles. Supply extraocular muscle, responsible for movement of the eyeball. Then you have V1, which is ophthalmic nerve, sensation from the eye, maxillary nerve, which is responsible for sensation from the upper teeth and maxilla. So those are how many nerves now? 1, 2, 3 cranial nerve and 2 divisions of trigeminal. 5 nerves traveling through the cavernous sinus. Abducent in the floor and the rest in the lateral wall. In addition to that, if you remember, below here, bitraspone, through the bitraspone there is internal carotid artery traveling, carotid canal. So carotid canal, where internal carotid travel through it, then ascend and get back again to the base of the brain. So this is the internal carotid artery. Internal carotid artery traveling in the floor. Internal carotid artery traveling in the floor of the sinus. Okay. So to summarize the contents of cavernous sinus, lateral wall, you have cranial nerve number 3, cranial nerve number 4, you have V1, V2 of 5. Okay? Then in the floor, you have cranial nerve number 6 and internal carotid artery. Okay. What are tributaries of cavernous sinus? Cavernous sinus communicate with other veins. Receive veins. So in this side, I'm going to focus on tributaries. What are the veins coming to the cavernous sinus? You will see coming through superior orbital fissure, ophthalmic veins. Okay, communicate with the cavernous sinus on the other side by intercavernous sinuses. Then you have from the cerebrum superficial cerebral vein. Then also coming from front here at the lesser wing of sphenoid, if you remember, you have sphenoparietal sinus. Behind here, you have inferior petrosal sinus, and superior petrosal sinus also communicate with cavernous sinus. Inferior petrosal sinus, superior petrosal sinus. So it has extensive communication. It receive veins from the front, ophthalmic, receive veins, another sinus, which is sphenoparietal, communicate with its fellow through intercavernous, and receive veins from brain and the meninges, also meningeal veins and superficial cerebral veins. So also there is meningeal veins. In addition to that, through foramen ovale, here is the foramen ovale, you have emissary vein which communicate cavernous sinus with pterygoid venous plexus. So this is emissary vein that communicate cavernous sinus with pterygoid venous plexus. How this communication explain dangerous triangle in the face? Why we have in face something called dangerous triangle and how it is related to cavernous sinus? If you remember, if you go back, you have, here is the eye, nose, So which vein start here? Facial vein. It starts as angular, then continue as facial vein. And it is formed by communication or by supratrochlear and supraorbital veins join each other. So this is become facial vein. Facial vein communicate with ophthalmic here, ophthalmic, which take you to the cavernous sinus. Facial vein communicate with pterygoid venous plexus through deep facial, go to pterygoid venous plexus, and from there through foramen ovale, emissary vein, go to cavernous sinus. Correct? This is emissary vein. So here is the ophthalmic vein, and here is deep facial, go to pterygoid venous plexus, and from there emissary vein up to cavernous sinus. That's why this region, we call it dangerous triangle. Here is the eye, okay, and here is the upper lip. So this area we call it dangerous triangle. Why dangerous triangle? Because infection here can transmit to the cavernous sinus, either at the upper part here through ophthalmic, or lower here through deep facial to pterygoid plexus, emissary vein up to cavernous sinus. And go back to the venous drainage of face. We covered this before in another lecture. Okay, so the end result, if there is infection here and spread to the cavernous sinus, is going to lead what we call it cavernous sinus thrombosis. And the cavernous sinus thrombosis, it is a complication of infection from the dangerous triangle in face to cavernous sinus. What are the most important feature based on this communication on the contents of cavernous sinus? Remember, what are the contents of cavernous sinus? You have cranial nerves number 3, number 4, number 6. Those are supplying extraocular muscle. So irritation of these nerves lead to ophthalmoplegia. The patient cannot move eyeball. Second, you have V1 and V2 of trigeminal, ophthalmic and maxillary. So there is pain and headache in the area supplied by V1 and V2, like forehead, okay, and over maxilla. Those are the common area between the eye and upper lip, between the eye and upper lip. Okay, what else? Okay, it drain ophthalmic vein and also central retinal vein. I forgot to tell you also one of things which you go back to the cavernous sinus, central retinal vein. Central coming from optic canal. Here is the optic canal. So central retinal vein coming from retina. Central retinal vein. Okay, so basically it's going to be papilledema, swelling of eyeball. Okay, I hope that this is clear. And also complication, spread of infection to brain tissue, encephalitis through internal carotid artery branches or cerebral veins. Cerebral veins. Because internal carotid travel through it and it gives branches to cerebrum, and also superficial cerebral veins which drain the brain tissue, and the infection can spread through them, lead to encephalitis. Thank you.